a slow slide towards corporatisation, marketisation, that is, I think, not compatible with the broader social purposes of a university for research, teaching, for scholarship. Increasingly it's becoming an industry and run along corporate principles. And if students are required to pay a larger proportion of the costs of running this industry, they will act like customers. They're already referred to by some of the university managers in that way. So it's not just, in my mind, the problems of inequality of access to higher education that will result from making it more expensive. Of course, the rich will still continue to go to university. Why wouldn't they? Indeed, it becomes even more an exclusive club if it becomes more expensive. So there are adverse consequences, I think, for any egalitarian conception, but I think there are also adverse consequences for the nature of higher education itself, which could, in the longer term, impair the productivity of society. And frankly, one wastes resources, one wastes the human resource, the human capacity of young people if you deny them higher education simply because they can't afford it. And ladies and gentlemen, we can all remember, can't we, that we used to have free tertiary education introduced by the Whitlam government at a time when Australia was a lot poorer. How come that we could afford things like that when we were poorer that apparently we can't afford now? It's frankly bizarre.
That's what made us richer.
Okay, my question's Win from the committee. My question is, I think, to both of you, and it relates to political will. Now, the party that we do have to look to have political will when it becomes the government is, of course, the Labor Party. So I'd like to ask Chris, because you are from the Evatt Foundation, which is very supportive of Labor in its wider sense, including the Labor Party, and you, Frank. You mentioned Andrew Leigh. We've all been impressed when he is the Shadow Minister, I presume, for what? Finance? And he's a former academic in economics. Do you think, what is your estimate of the amount of political will a shortened Labor government and an Andrew Leigh as a major minister will have in dealing with some of the specifics you talked about, which is closing the tax loopholes for the very wealthy, negative gearing, which absolutely keeps on favouring those who have capital, the superannuation benefits, etc., etc. What is your estimate of the political will that a new Labor government would have on those specific issues to do with accumulation of capital?
Good question. I think it will depend on the context. I think there will. I think that if the political context, if they can reckon on the political context, not punishing them for redressing inequality, I think that they will. I think the will's there to that extent. Would they put themselves at risk in terms of being re-elected by doing these sorts of things? Well, I don't think so. So it really comes back to, I think they're more of a, I think the will's, as much will's there as is politically, pragmatically possible for them to get away with. That's how I would assess it. So I would think that the important thing is to try and build a very broad base rather than look to the leadership as such.
Yeah, I suspect my comments echo Chris's pretty clearly, because actually he and I had an interesting conversation with Andrew Leigh recently about these very issues. But I think one can't expect the Labor government in the run-up to the Labor opposition in the run-up to the next general election to be talking about new taxes. It'd be just a gift to Abbott and Hockey, and Christ, don't they need a gift right now. They're in such political strife that they'd be about the only thing that could save them is a scare campaign about Labour's new taxes. Now, that really does create a dilemma, doesn't it? Because if Labour gets locked in to promising no new taxes, oh God, what do promises matter these days? No one believes anything, do they? But I think there probably is a will within many people in the Labour movement, the trade unions, the Labour Party, to really take some more decisive action on a whole range of issues. Taxation of superannuation, negative gearing, closing tax rorts associated with family trusts, other tax loopholes. I mean, if we want to fund those policies like the Gonski education policies, decent health policies, we've got to have a decent tax base. There's no immediate budget emergency, but there sure as hell is a long-run problem, and it's not going to be repaired without more tax is paid by the wealthier segments of Australian society. It has to be done, and I think in the longer term Labor has to face up to that prospect, but one cannot seriously expect Labor to be saying that in the run-up to the next federal election. It just doesn't make political sense for them.
Just one other reflection is that as the distribution of income and wealth heads back to the levels that were last apparent in 1914, it's kind of like interesting to think that of the politics back in 1914. In a sense, we're kind of like we're facing again the same problems that the people in 1914 and that pre-First World War era faced, and so. And we know how kind of like the story went at that time. After the First World War, the options sort of rapidly foreclosed around the revolutionary communist movement on the one side, the social democrats who were trying to work through the parliamentary system, and the liberal reformers. And there were quite severe shifts, splits I should say. And now we're kind of, it's kind of interesting that it's almost as though the reform movement has now got a second chance. We've now passed through the whole communist period. It's been washed out of the system. As we look back at it now, we've obviously had mixed results. Sort of the communist movement's turned into murderous autocracies on the one hand, but on the other hand, they were an incredibly powerful lever for convincing the democracies to introduce social security and all kinds of other things. So it was mixed results, but it's now, and obviously they weren't permanent results, because now whatever we achieved is now wearing away, and we're heading back to what it was in that pre-First World War period, when the politics of what happened in the labour movement, in the working class, and with liberal reformers was completely open. And so we're sort of heading back to a situation where, again, it's completely open, and I think we've sort of got an opportunity to see if we can do it better this time.
There is a big difference to the 1914 era, and that is that there was a powerful labour movement which was able to create a culture that provided a real alternative to the capitalist system. And at the moment, the problem seems to me to be that we've lost the ideological battle. There are virtually no media that support the labour cause. I mean, it's fine for us to talk about inequality. We all know that's true, but the masses don't believe it. They believe the neoliberal ideology that there is no alternative. It's been a very powerful ideology. It's fueled by the wealth of the media barons. There is no alternative public culture anymore that debunks that. And the question is, what do we do to create a culture which will show, you know, how untrue the ideology is and what the real social situation is?
I'm not sure that it is as bleak as you paint it. We've just had a quite an impressive State of the Union address from President Obama, who really has sort of raised the inequality issue very highly. This has been taken up by the IMF, it's been taken up by the Pope. I think there's widespread discontent right throughout generally throughout Australia with the budget. I don't think we're enclosed at this point. I think it's a rare moment. I agree with him to that extent, but I don't think we're enclosed, there is no alternative moment. I think there are alternative proposals coming out all over the place.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, fine. Next question.
Yeah. I'd like to, how does Piketty how would he address three problems? One is a policy strategy that shames the poor out of poverty and justifies austerity. A strategy that prevents shaming the rich and powerful by oppressing human rights and equality. And third, why does Piketty seem to ignore the existence of economic rent, which is produced by society and nature, and use that as a means to equalize the playing field?
Next question. The question of economic rent, I will comment on, Geoffrey, which is, I think, very fundamental. None of us have actually talked about the environmental issue. Our relationship to nature is possibly the key to unlocking many of these concerns. Climate change, environmental stresses are a huge shadow hanging over us all in the 21st century. And we can't address these problems adequately unless they're done in conjunction with questions of equality. I mean, look around the world, the rich countries, the poor countries, they can't agree on a common strategy for climate change action because the poor countries want what the rich countries have got, and the rich countries aren't willing to give it up. So any notion of progressive redistribution is such a great obstacle to international agreement on climate change action. And even within nations, I mean, well, yes, the problem with the carbon tax is that, played into the hands of the skeptics who argued that it was driving up cost of living and making life unaffordable for poor Australians. And a lot of people voted against Abbott, against the Gillard-Rudd government, and ushered in Tony Abbott to smash the tax. All of this is divisive. Unless we can somehow work together for common principles, then we're not going to make much progress here. Now, that's not quite the same question you're asking about rent, but I think if we could get a taxation system that, for example, penalised rents, that charge people for the use of nature, then we would be on the road to getting more social balance, more ecological sanity, alongside more egalitarian outcomes. I don't know if that helps, but that's how I see the situation.
I have a brief comment and two brief questions. My brief comment concerns the first question, and that is education. I just think that the present government's stupidity, I use that word advisedly, is hard to beat other than by reference to their policy on education. After all, Joe Stiglitz and other people have pointed out that a principal contribution to the great divergence is the increasing cost of education in the United States. My two questions are, first, why is it, do you think, that Piketty has gotten such attention compared with the book Why Nations Fail by Asa McGlue and Robinson, which after all says any country where an elite exploits the situation in order to benefit themselves will fail? The second question is, what is it that happened in about 1980 that led to the Great Divergence? I mean, I know there was that dope Reagan and that hideous woman Thatcher, but I mean, what was it that happened that suddenly it all started to diverge?
I'll just make two comments. I think that why is Piketty attracted attention? Well, there are kind of like a lot of reasons, but one is that it attracted the attention of the United States, because the United States is now, by Piketty's reckoning, the most unequal society ever in all history. And so that is resonating, and so then he comes along with a book to be able to explain why it is the most unequal society in all history. So I think that's the first thing. And what caused the Great Divergence? Well, here is kind of like a little bit heretical, if I'm going to rely on Piketty, and he would say that yes, all those other factors and the policies associated with neoliberalism are contributory, but he actually says that the main reason is the slowdown of growth. The growth is there was an unusual period of growth. There was an unusual destruction of wealth after the First World War and during the Great Depression, and then there was an unusual burst of growth, particularly in Europe in the catch-up process. The US didn't go down so far, went up a little bit, but particularly in Europe it was quite spectacular, the growth in the post-war period. But all around the world that period is known as sort of the golden era of capitalism because of the rate of growth. It is slow growth that when you have slow growth, growth is the counter to increasing wealth inequality. Wealth inequality keeps increasing at that 5% kind of roughly rate of return every year, but once growth sort of drops from about 4% to 1%, then everybody else's income falls way behind. And what he projects into the future is a growth rate of around about, going forward into this century, of around about 1.5%. That's a median projection, and assuming we solve the hydrocarbon problem. If we don't solve the hydrocarbon problem, the growth rate going forward is going to be lower than that. So assuming we solve that problem, he's looking at a median projection of about 1.5% per annum, which is, as it happens, around about precisely the same growth rate as the 19th century. So again, I come back to this theme that what we're doing is we're heading back to the 19th century and the problems of the 19th century, and it's growth-fueled. The policy issues about removing the taxes and the progressive taxes are all very important, but the fundamental thing is that slow growth is back, and so capital is back in a big way as well.
Charlie Bradley. I'll take up from that one with regard to slow growth. Another view would be, in fact, that the changes and indeed the growth worldwide is actually quite dramatic. And I'm thinking that particularly with regard to health, education and whatever. I'm talking about technological change. But while that's the background, and it's more than just slow growth that we're dealing with. I'm interested in the question of the collaboration, which historically we seem to rely on our unions to provide in taking on the 0.1%. I don't think the unions are equipped to do this. I think the nature of work and the relationships in the workplace and the communications between people are changing so dramatically that new forms of collaboration are needed. New institutions will need to evolve to really take on the question of political will. Could you comment, please?
That's some big issues, Charlie. On this technical question about whether slow growth is a widespread concern, I'm a little sceptical, I have to say, that looking back to that golden age period that Chris was just referring to, following the Second World War, yes, it was a period of pretty sustained growth over a quarter of a century. But it was also a period of commitment to redistributive policies, and it was an era in which the union movement was strong. So I think all the ingredients were there for getting rich and getting redistributive in the way in which those riches were shared throughout society. Now, it wasn't in all respects a golden age. People who lived through the 50s and 60s know about racism, sexism, ASIO, all the appalling features of that era. But in purely economic terms, it was an era in which the potential for a more sharing distribution of economic wealth was present. Things have changed, though, particularly in a country like Australia, but meanwhile, other opportunities open up in countries like China. Rapid economic growth, social transformations, you know, rural to urban migration on a scale that it's frankly hard to get your head around. So it's difficult to generalise about what's happening on a world scale in terms of the capacity to harness that additional wealth and redistribute it more equitably. Frankly, I'm not very optimistic about the prospect of that happening in China, India, Brazil, you know, the so-called BRICS countries. That's actually where a lot of the current action is in terms of wealth generation and the potential, or often the frustrated potential, for redistribution. So that's a bit of a rant, but remind me of the last part of your question, Charlie.
Changing the relationships in institutions like unions to actually take on.
Oh yeah. Look, I think Chris's earlier argument is very interesting in this regard. Yes, some of our institutions are pretty weak. The Labour Party isn't demonstrably social democratic. The unions aren't demonstrably covering the workforce adequately and using economic power. But there is, I think, a broader opportunity for a new era of reformism. Chris referred to the currents within that earlier era of reformism. You had the communist movement, small L liberalism, social democracy, often fighting amongst each other, you know, to signal which was the best way forward. Well, we've come through an era of neoliberalism, which has created economic crisis, environmental crisis, and growing inequality. There's surely the prospect now for some reconfiguration of those reform movements to try to establish a society and economy that is indeed more equitable, more sustainable, more compatible with modern aspirations for a decent quality of life. In other words, though none of us have the answers to this challenge, I think the potential is there. It's like the material conditions, the historical momentum to do something that is concerned not with sort of smashing capitalism in the way in which sort of storming the Winter Palace, you know, in St. Petersburg, but, you know, reconfiguring an alliance of small L liberalism, labourism, social democracy, in order to achieve those social goals of sustainability and equity.
Yeah, and let me just add that in the pre-World War period, we were still trying to establish in large parts of the world the basic democratic franchise. This time the franchise has been well and truly established, and look, you know, we've got the numbers. We're talking about the interests of something like 90% of the population, perhaps even, you know, 99%. Now this is an overwhelming majority. So there are big advantages in this that we've got to look, big opportunities here, and the broadest possible coalition, I think, has to be good.
Why do they vote for Abbott?
They're stupid.
Hello. Given on a question of equity and sustainability, given that capitalism is based on a limitless growth and the problems that creates for the planet, undermining the very material foundations of our existence, there's been some talk about a steady state economy, and with the changing nature of work, with technological unemployment, structural unemployment, permanent unemployment, there's been some discussion, mainly in Europe, about creating a citizen's income, a guaranteed income for all as a way of redistributing the wealth, creating a truly just society. How do you feel about that?
Yeah. You see, there's a young man named Troy Henderson who's just starting a PhD in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney, looking at the potential for that basic income to have traction here in Australia. I'm looking forward to supervising and helping him with his research in that topic. But it does seem to me as an example of the sort of the potential for specific policies that link into that broader politics that Chris and I have been talking about. Basic income, which would be independent of work, a citizen's income. We can afford it. But we of course need a decent taxation system that will ensure that the wealth generated is used and redistributed in that way. I think technically there's no problem, but the question of political will and political agency is the major challenge.
On a point where big corporations tend to contribute to social inequality, what is your opinion on Rupert Murdoch's involvement in the suppression of democracy in countries like Australia, with given the fact that he has aligned himself to this ideology of neoliberalism, that he decides to use his power as an entrepreneurial media figure to control the mass media, prescribe his own economic policies, which the Abbott government follows, which I think is really stupid, as well as spread negative and false ideas of people who actually dare to stand up and fight for the fair go.
Oh, I just kind of like agree with you. What do you do?
It's a classic example of the Joseph Stiglitz problem, isn't it? You have a ridiculous concentration of economic wealth, in this case, ridiculous concentration of power in the hands of a media baron of this kind. It's not surprising that governments tremble at the prospect of him turning all his media outlets into propaganda organs to change governments. I mean, it's a terrible vicious cycle. Look, I invite the general audience to come up with a solution to this.
Impact. This stuff has no impact. Western suburbs of Sydney in the general election, the Queensland election, the Victorian election. The Murdoch press campaigned in all of those three, and it had no effect. So in fact, the people who are worried about him should change, as Jackie Lambie did, you backed the wrong guy, suck it up.
Yeah, I think Green Left Weekly had more traction with Kick This Mob Out than Murdoch did, although it did work, didn't it?
Okay, this is the last question, ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, hi. I just wondered what Piketty says about free trade agreements, international trade agreements, and their contribution to wealth creation or the creation of inequality around the world. Nothing.
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 Well, in that case, you can have one more question.
Are they new? They're not new.
I thought that was the last. No, it was just the answer was so short. I said we can have another question.
I looked very angry. I think that was the point. Even though Jane is a good friend of mine. I noted that the name of Malcolm Fraser came up, and I will remember when Malcolm Fraser spoke here, and I asked him what had brought about his change of mind about things, and to which he answered, I have not changed at all. It's the Liberal Party that's changed. I'm wondering, is it his memory or mine that are
I don't know how, whether I'm any more qualified to sort of answer these sort of questions than anybody else.
It's Frank's comment.
Oh, it was Frank's comment?
Yes.
Look, very difficult, isn't it? Has Fraser changed? Does it matter? I don't know that I care that much. He was a bastard, you know, in conspiring to overthrow the democratic government by engaging in unconstitutional means, conspiring with Barwick and Kerr to get rid of a flawed but progressive government. I don't know that he ever thoroughly recanted. He and Gough made up, but that tells you more about Gough's generosity of spirit than anything else. His policies marked a watershed in Australian history, ushering in an era where neoliberalism came to be orthodoxy. I've still got my, you know, export Fraser not uranium badge. Once more with feeling, ladies and gentlemen. Shame, Fraser, shame. Look, I mean, I know he's a hero because he got stuck into John Howard and the Liberal Party, but God, you know, should we get too much pleasure from disarray among our opponents? Only if we had something coherent on offer ourselves. I think the earlier question about what's to be done, you know, with Labour, with a broader social alliance for progressive policies is where this conversation really leads us to looking forward, as they say in the classics. So if we're going to stop looking back at Fraser or looking back at Jane Austen and the 19th century and upstairs, downstairs and all of that nonsense, we really need to be thinking about how we develop a new progressive coalition involving the Greens, non-governmental organisations, AFTINET, the people opposing these appalling so-called free trade agreements, the progressive elements within the Labour Party, the unions. This is the way forward, and frankly, let's put the whole of that history, Fraser, Howard, the whole sorry bunch of them behind us as we move forward.
I think he's good.
Okay, I'll take that as a thank you to our speakers for tonight. I think it was a wonderful evening. And next week, the topic's going to be Islamophobia in Australia, the politics of race hate in neoliberal Australia. So we're back to neoliberalism and another nasty facet of it. So hope you come back then. Thank you. Good night.